Announcement. This booklet I, Klaas van der Veen, have written over the past 10 years, the last 2 years of our life in a small rural village, and the 8 years since we have been living in a larger town. It tells of my life with an Alzheimer's patient who has become increasingly helpless. That is why the booklet is titled My Life with Alzheimer, not he himself but my wife, with the subtitle The Caregiver. Foreword. Sometimes a story begins without you ever seeking it. It grows quietly, day by day, year after year. This is such a story. Not imagined, but lived. A chronicle of love, care, struggle, perseverance, sorrow, and above all, fidelity. Written in the shelter of daily life, but with the awareness that many others stand in the same storm. This booklet is for them. As recognition, as comfort, as guidance, or perhaps simply as a companion on a difficult path. Contents. Chapter 1, The First Signs. The story begins quietly with small moments that hint at change, smiles, laughter, subtle shifts in memory. A gentle introduction to how Alzheimer first made its presence known. Chapter 2, The Road to Moving Gradually. Daily life becomes more challenging. This chapter explores the emotional and practical journey of considering a move, leaving a familiar home, and adjusting to new surroundings. Chapter 3, The Diagnosis. The moment of truth, receiving the Alzheimer's diagnosis. Emotions, realizations, and the beginning of a new way of living together under the shadow of the disease. Chapter 4, The Crisis Admission. A sudden health crisis brings hospitalization and temporary care. This chapter reveals the vulnerability, the trust required, and the lessons learned about planning and seeking support. Chapter 5, Incontinence. Facing the intimate realities of incontinence, learning the necessary routines, and discovering that love can be expressed in care, patience, and quiet devotion. Chapter 6, Organization: How to Manage the Daily Demands of Caregiving. Routines, timing, patience, and balance. Practical guidance interwoven with reflections on maintaining dignity and connection. Chapter 7, Daily Life: 8 years in the new home, with routines shaping each day. Meals, hygiene, music, and quiet moments form the rhythm of life, showing both the challenges and the enduring presence of love. Chapter 8, The Future. The disease progresses, dependence increases, and physical frailty becomes more apparent. Reflections on love, vigilance, hope, and the resilience required to continue caring. Chapter 9, Closing 10 years of caregiving, reflected upon commitment, enduring love, and the quiet pride of having stood by a loved one through a long and difficult journey. Afterward, a final reflection: love is care, and care is an art. The hope is that readers recognize themselves, find comfort, and feel less alone in the challenges of caregiving.
Chapter 1, The First Signs. It was not a blow to the face, not a sudden bolt of lightning, no. It began with something small. She suddenly started laughing again at my silly jokes. You must understand, she hadn't done that for years. I had long written off my sense of humor as worn out and outdated, but there she was, eyes sparkling, shaking with laughter at a joke I must have told 100 times. It was touching and strange. Perhaps only later did I realize that something wasn't right. Her mind seemed to be reaching back to an earlier life, to a lighter corner of her memory where my jokes were still fresh, but at the time, I didn't think much of it. We were laughing together again. And isn't laughter always good? She was always to be found in the garden. Our garden. A colorful chaos of flowers. A bit English. A bit willful. Everything grew there, except rules. She knew exactly what grew where, when something would bloom, how deep a root had to be set. But suddenly, as if out of nowhere, she lost her grip on that little paradise. The borders grew wild. Weeds she would once have recognized in her sleep were now given free rein. Only the garden path still caught her attention. She swept it clean as if it were her last task on earth, even when there was only a single leaf upon it. Chapter 2, The Road to Moving. I could not take over the garden. My back had not allowed it for years, so cautiously, I began the conversation about moving. An apartment, perhaps, without a garden. It seemed sensible to me. But her resistance was quiet and unyielding. She was that garden. That patch of earth was her memory, even before Alzheimer came to steal it. I could hardly blame her. Still, I pressed on, because I saw what she no longer wished to see. Shopping became a challenge. Not all at once, but little by little. More and more often she came home with things we already had in abundance. Toothbrushes, while 4 still lay in the cupboard. Or milk, even though I had just put 2 fresh cartons in the fridge that same morning. What she forgot most was what we didn't have. I noticed that the little list she carried in her head was slowly dissolving, like sugar in tea. So I went with her. Every time. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't want her to get lost in the aisles of the supermarket. She still smoked in those days. But even that became difficult. She forgot the name of her brand, so I wrote it on a note. Sometimes she lost the note, or forgot to hand it to the cashier. In the end, I just bought them myself. Meanwhile, the search for another home went on, steadily. At first, reluctantly, I admit, the garden was still a sore point, but gradually it began to dawn on her. Perhaps a house without a garden was not only necessary, but even a little soothing. No more worries about weeds, no more frustration over flowers that no longer bloomed as they once had. No more battles with the past. We went looking together. Apartments, some with a balcony, others with a view of a small park. Sometimes with an estate agent present, polite but blind to what I saw, the confusion in her eyes, as she wondered whether we were really supposed to live here. Whether this was to become her new home. Sometimes on the way back she asked if we had already bought a place. Then I would whisper, "Not yet, love. We're just still looking." Until one day, the realization came over me completely. We must do this now. Not later. Not when things got worse still. A ground-level home, without stairs, without a garden, with a lift, close to one of our children. Someone who could come quickly if needed. I was tired. My back had long since stopped cooperating, but above all, I could no longer do it alone. It felt like betrayal, but it was love. And so it happened. From the quiet countryside, where in the mornings you could still hear birds and distant tractors, we moved to the big city. For me, it carried a touch of melancholy, as if I were closing a chapter forever. Yet at the same time, it was also a relief. It felt like a necessary decision, not out of convenience, but out of care. I had set my sights on new construction, no trouble with leaks, wood rot, or unexpected repairs. Everything fresh, everything new, like a blank page on which we could begin again together. And chance, or perhaps fate, arranged that, near one of our sons, a brand new neighborhood was rising from the ground. Apartments, modern and sleek, with a lift and energy ratings that would please the government. During a visit to our son, we walked there. The scaffolding was still up. You had to look past the concrete to see what it might become. But she looked, and she smiled. She could picture it, in her own way. Perhaps because she didn't fully understand, or perhaps because she understood all too well. Either way, her reaction was surprisingly positive. No resistance, no longing for the garden, no remark about what she was leaving behind. Just that quiet nod, as if to say, yes, this is good. So we took the step. The agent was called in. Paperwork, signatures, discussions. I handled most of it. She watched along, now and then, but the details slipped through her more and more. And that was fine. It didn't matter. Life does not need to be understood in order still to be felt. And so we bought the apartment. Top floor, 5 stories high. A beautiful view over the city, as if from there you could still hold on to a bit of the world below. I pictured her sitting there one day, by the window, perhaps with a cup of coffee, or simply silent, gazing at the sky, and I thought, this may not be the end, but it is a new beginning. By the time we moved, her confusion had already been our silent companion for 2 years. It was always there, like a mist between words, but we did not speak of it. Perhaps we could not, perhaps we dared not, perhaps it was her fear, or my inability to face it fully. We lived around it, as if carefully polishing a porcelain vase already cracked. After the move, it became visible, unavoidable. In the old house she knew every corner, every cupboard, every tap. There, her body still remembered what her mind forgot. But in the new apartment, everything was strange. Sleek and beautiful, yes, but without the familiarity of years. Her usual little bowl for the keys was gone. The light switch was in a different place. The smell was different. The view, no garden anymore, but a horizon of windows and rooftops. She knew there was a lift. I had told her often enough, but pressing the button, recognizing the right floor, waiting for the soft ping, it was all too much. Once I asked her to fetch the newspaper from the mailbox downstairs. It seemed a small errand, perhaps even a way to give her a little independence. She was gone for at least 15 minutes. When I finally saw her coming back, it was as if she had returned from another world. She had the newspaper, yes, but her eyes were restless. She had not been able to find our home again. The 5th floor had become a maze. As if she were walking through a building without anchor, without direction, without ground beneath her feet. From that moment on, I did everything. Not out of duty, but out of love. All the household tasks fell to me. She had no sense anymore of how the new appliances worked. The microwave remained a mystery. The air fryer, the induction hob, they might as well have come from a science fiction film. The washing machine, the dryer, the coffee maker, none of it meant anything to her anymore. Sometimes she stood by, sometimes she watched. And then I saw a kind of shame, mingled with confusion, as if she knew what she had lost but no longer had the words to say it. I had bought the apartment to make her life easier. And mine. But it gradually became my workplace, my lookout post, my care station. And she drifted further and further away. Slowly, very slowly, like a small boat leaving the harbor, while the ropes still cling a moment to the quay. Chapter 3. The Diagnosis. 4 months after moving into the new apartment, the already fragile balance broke. I had to be admitted to the hospital for major surgery. My back had long since given out, and now my shoulder failed me too, as if my body itself was protesting against the burden I had carried alone for too long. She thought she could manage on her own at home. She said it with a steady voice. But I knew better, and soon it became clear. She lost her way in her own home, forgot to eat, no longer knew how the day began or ended. Fortunately, our children and relatives stepped in right away. They stayed overnight, took over the care as best they could. Without them, I know for certain, things would already have collapsed then. 2 months later, I persuaded her to come with me to the hospital, not for tests, but simply to be with me, together, as always. It was there, in a small room with soft voices and leaflets on the table, that we finally received certainty. Alzheimer's, in an advanced stage, said the doctor. 5 words. Not unexpected, yet final. She refused to believe it. She looked at me as if it were a mistake, an error in the system. And perhaps she was right. In her mind, there was no illness, only confusion, and sometimes sadness. But the word Alzheimer's was, for her, an abstraction, something that belonged to others. For me, it was a confirmation. Now at last we could ask for help. Finally, we started with a case manager, someone who thought with us, who helped us reorganize our lives with eyes wide open. Because I could no longer do it alone. My back, my shoulder, the restless nights, it was too much. Fortunately, during construction, I had arranged something for which I would later be endlessly grateful. In consultation with the builder, we had installed a shower spacious enough for the two of us together, just like in the old house, not out of luxury, but out of necessity. She could no longer manage the controls, did not know hot from cold, how to use shampoo or even where to stand. That became my task. To wash her, to keep her safe, to hold her under the warm stream as if I could thereby hold back time itself. Sometimes she said nothing. Sometimes she laughed suddenly. And sometimes she looked at me with a glance I remembered from long ago, from when we were young. For a moment, she was there again. Our apartment is above a shopping center. Directly above a large supermarket, always busy. Sometimes, standing at the window, I look down. At the hurried life, the people with full bags, children in hand, young people laughing at things I no longer understand. And then I think, 1 in 5 of you. 1 in 5 people develops Alzheimer's. Like my wife. Like me perhaps one day. And then I smile faintly, half in sorrow. Do you already think of building a 2-person shower? Not for comfort, but for care. For the love hidden in practical acts. And then I close the curtain again. And turn around. Because life goes on below. But up here, we are still fighting, softly and quietly, against time. Slowly but surely she changed again. Alzheimer's never moves in one sudden blow. It creeps in, like a mist hiding more and more each day. She began drumming. With her right hand, tap, 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 on the table, on the arm of a chair, sometimes on her own knee. Compulsively. As if it were a leftover movement from a world slipping from her grasp. Tap, tap. I could hear it even from another room. It became a kind of clock in the house, her quiet presence. The names disappeared. First those of distant acquaintances, then those of family. Until my own name too was gone. She looked at me, she saw me, she felt me, yes. She was not startled by my face or my voice. She knew that I belonged to her. But my name was nowhere to be found. Her own name was gone as well. That beautiful name I once so often whispered softly in her ear. When I asked, "What is your name?" she looked at me and remained silent, not angry, not sad, just empty, and the children, the sons and daughters she herself had brought into the world, they too became nameless, but not unknown. No, she still recognized their faces, she felt the bond, sometimes smiled, reached out her hand. The soul recognizes more than memory allows. Speaking grew less. At first, the sentences grew shorter, then gaps appeared in the conversations, and then silence, not because she no longer wanted to speak, but because she could not. Only one phrase remained, a sentence without clear meaning, which she used as an answer to almost everything, again and again. I wondered, does she still understand me? Is she trying to say something? Is that phrase all that is left trapped in her own mind? And then, suddenly, that strange exception. I hummed a tune from long ago. One of those old Dutch songs we used to sing on bike rides or while washing the dishes. And then the miracle happened. As if someone had flicked a switch, she looked up, her mouth moved, and without hesitation she filled in the line. Flawlessly. Word for word. As if it had all been stored away, safe in a corner untouched by Alzheimer's. There she was. In silence. In unknowing. But in music. She lived again. there was her voice. There was something of the past. Technically, she could still speak, but free will, word-finding, saying something of her own, that was gone. What remained were reflexes, traces of memory. As a stone in the grass still marks where a house once stood. I listened to her, and to her silences. And I understood. Something remains. Not much. Not enough. But something. And for now, for today, that is sufficient. She still smoked then, and quite a lot. 4 or 5 packs a week. Always on the balcony. Inside it was not really allowed. I let it be. Perhaps because it was one of the few things she still recognized as hers, as familiar. The ritual of lighting up, standing outside for a moment, blowing out the smoke, it gave her a moment of calm, or perhaps of memory, but even that ritual was slowly distorted. One day a neighbor from a few floors below spoke to me, polite but clear. Did I know that cigarette butts were falling from our balcony? I was startled. No, I didn't know. Apparently she did it when I wasn't looking, tossed the butts over the edge, thoughtlessly, without realizing that there were people living below. In the past she would never have done such a thing. Her sense of decency had always been sharp. I tried to discuss it with her gently, but she didn't understand. Or had forgotten before I finished speaking. And then, suddenly, it ended. Not because I forbade it, not because someone had persuaded her, but simply because she could no longer manage it. The lighter became incomprehensible. The spark would not come. She no longer understood that a cigarette was something to be smoked. She began breaking them, tearing them apart. Once she even put a piece in her mouth, as if it were food. That frightened me. And yet, that was the end of smoking. No drama, no struggle, no last cigarette. It was simply over. The habit slipped away quietly, like so many other things slipped away from her. Not in a single moment, but in small, silent fragments. I never bought cigarettes for her again. It was as if her body itself or her spirit had decided, this is no longer needed, or this is no longer possible. And so something else was released. Something that had accompanied her for years now remained only as a memory. For me, she did not miss it, or no longer knew. I missed the ritual, the little moments on the balcony, the smell, strange though it was, the image of her there, against the light, with a small cloud of smoke rising slowly. It was a piece of her. And now, it was gone. Like so many pieces, disappearing one by one. Chapter 4. The Crisis Admission. We had been living in our new apartment for just 4 years. We had only just begun, it seemed, to find a new balance. The steady routines, the care I had taken over, the quiet mutual dependence. And then, on an ordinary day, everything was turned upside down again. Something unbelievable happened. Something I had never expected. A stroke. In medical terms, an acquired brain injury. But for me it was simply shutting down. My speech deserted me. Sentences no longer formed. The words that had always come so easily were trapped behind an invisible wall. Writing was impossible too, as if a gap had suddenly opened between thought and action. I even tried to send a WhatsApp message to our children. Just a simple line, something is wrong. But even that didn't work. I could think the words, see them clearly in my mind, but my fingers refused to type. It was as if an invisible wall stood between my brain and my hand. Fortunately, miraculously, it all came back. The doctors said my brain had found another part to take over the function. My speech center, as it were, had moved into a new room in my head. It sounds simple, almost technical. But in reality it was confusing, frustrating, frightening. What weighed far more heavily, however, was everything that came with it. A long hospital stay, followed by weeks in a rehabilitation center. In total, about 4 or 5 weeks completely out of circulation. And while I, as a walking patient, was being helped wonderfully by speech therapists practicing letters and words with me, arrangements had to be made at home. My wife, fully dependent on me, could of course not be left alone. Our children, our dear children, stepped in immediately. They arranged a crisis admission for her. Everything happened quickly. No time for long discussions or gradual transitions. It had to be done, and it was done. And that is why I now advise everyone: move, if you can, timely to a place near your children, not just for companionship, but for these moments. When I was finally recovered enough, and the rehabilitation center allowed me to leave, she came back. From the crisis center, she walked, or rather was brought, into our apartment, looking around as if everything were new. She vaguely recognized me, I think, but not fully. It was as if we had to get to know each other all over again, as if those weeks had removed her not only from our home but also from our life. She was distant. Not hostile, not afraid, but different. And me, I had to win her back. With gentle words, gestures, familiar songs, making coffee as before, taking her hand again as if it were the first time. And slowly, very slowly, we grew back together. I have often since thought how fragile a person is. One stroke, one illness, and everything shifts, but also how incredibly strong the bond between two people can be. Even when names are forgotten, even when words are missing, I am convinced caring for your loved one yourself, as long as you can, is the best. Not because a nursing home is bad, certainly not. But because the love between people, the daily touch, the smell of home, the familiar voices, all of that achieves far more than any rigid care schedule ever could. Even if you yourself are also vulnerable. Especially then. The next step was, in fact, a transition from the WMO to the WLZ. For outsiders, these are bureaucratic abbreviations, but for people in our situation, they mean something essential. The Long-Term Care Act offered more certainty, I was told. If something happened to me again, another collapse, another hospital admission, then under the WLZ, the path to temporary or long-term care for my wife would be better arranged. Of course, there was no guarantee that a spot would be available at that moment, but the idea alone brought peace. The application process itself was a journey, as so many things are at this stage of life: forms, meetings, waiting. And once the decision came, an administrative shift occurred. The care moved from my name to hers. It was no longer my help for her, but her right to support. A small, yet meaningful shift. I kept the help with household tasks. That was a major support. But now we could also get additional assistance. And so a caretaker came into the picture. A young woman, friendly, cheerful, attentive. She came for an hour and a half each week, played games, read aloud, just being there. At first, my wife did not like it. In the beginning, she looked at me as if I had betrayed her, as if, without her consent, I had placed her under supervision. And maybe, in a way, I had. She did not understand the situation, no longer knew what care meant, what help was. Anything unfamiliar felt like an intrusion. I must admit, that look, that almost hurt, pitying glance, it cut deep. And yet, something changed. Slowly, she began to recognize the young woman. Not by name, of course, but as someone kind, patient, smiling. And then, suddenly, I saw something I hadn't seen for a long time. My wife smiled back. Sometimes even out loud. They held hands or looked at an old photo album together, and then I saw something soft return to her eyes. It softened me too, because it is hard. Let's not shy away from that. The garden, once her pride and refuge, was gone. Reading, her greatest passion, 2 or 3 books a week, was over. She could follow no story anymore. Not in books, not on television. A film was too long, too complicated. A series, completely incomprehensible. But this new bond with the caretaker became, unexpectedly, a bright spot. She even began to wait for her. No words, no questions, but a certain calm when the doorbell rang at the familiar time. And then I thought, how good that we did this. How good that I kept looking for ways people help, because that is what care is, continuing to look. Not everything works immediately. Not everything is understood. Not everything feels right, but you keep trying, because you know, even in that confusion, in that disappearing life, moments of connection are still possible. And if she then, for a few minutes, feels human again among others, I feel once more something beyond being just her caregiver. I feel again her husband. Chapter 5. Incontinent. By now, we had been living in our new apartment for nearly 6 years. What had once felt unfamiliar had gradually become a familiar environment. For me, that is, because for her, everything always remained a bit strange, as if she were not in the world but beside it. Yet I always had the feeling that she understood me. Perhaps this is the most remarkable thing about Alzheimer's. You can no longer hold a conversation, yet communication still exists. A glance, a touch, a small reaction to a word or a song, it was still there, deep within. Recognition of her children, too, remained. No names, no stories, but a light in her eyes when she saw them, as if her soul knew what her memory had long let go of. But, as with anyone going through this disease, her condition slowly deteriorated. And at a certain point, we reached that stage one had known would come, but for which I had to steel myself internally, incontinence. No longer being able to go to the bathroom by herself, no longer knowing when she needed to, and not fully understanding what was happening. Guidance, help, care were required. At first, I felt a bit awkward about it. It was more intimate than anything we had experienced before, not in the romantic way of the past, but in a quiet, dutiful way I had not known yet. And yet, very quickly, I adapted. Not because it was easy or because it seemed natural, but because she herself made no issue of it. She did not resist, she was compliant, even a little grateful. And then you think, if she has no trouble with this, why should I? I learned the procedures, bought the right supplies, arranged protection and assistance, consulted with home care, listened to their advice. But above all, I learned to allow myself to continue feeling love in this stage. Because love, as it turned out, can also exist in changing someone who barely realizes it themselves. In a way, this might even have been the purest form of love we had ever known. What kept me going through it all was that she continued to recognize me. No words, no sentences. But when I entered the room, she looked at me with that gaze that said, "There you are again." And that was enough. That was everything. Chapter 6. Organization. How do you organize all of this? To be honest, there is no manual, no schedule you can simply follow. It starts with one thing: stick to your routines. The same rhythm every single day. Not because it's always convenient, but because it keeps her from getting lost. Any deviation from the familiar causes confusion, so you keep everything as simple as possible. And then there is the second point, no less important, an enormous amount of patience, and then some more patience. Sometimes I wonder where it all comes from. Because it never stops, not in the evenings, not on weekends, not on holidays. But I know this: staring in disbelief does no good. Not even when something completely unexpected happens. And believe me, that happens more often than you think. You cannot sigh or put it off. You handle it immediately, solve it immediately, and most importantly, tidy up immediately. That way you never face a mountain. The small discipline of each day, that is the secret. Don't wait until it becomes chaos. Stay ahead of it. The calendar is my second memory. I know when appointments are, who is coming, when home care arrives, or the doctor, or the caretaker. Timing is everything. For example, getting dressed, eating, going to bed. Everything at the right moment, not too early, not too late. A quarter of an hour earlier or later can make all the difference between calm and unrest. And of course, there are moments when it all feels like too much. Yet, I can say with conviction, I still have no trouble keeping my spirits up. Why? Because I know why I do it. For her, for who she was, and for who she still is, even if in a different way. That recognition, that trusting glance, that gentle smile when something still reaches her, that is my reward. And as long as I still get that back, I will keep going. Because she deserves it. In a way, I now live with a very clear purpose. And that is something worth having. The strange thing about myself is this. If I suspect she doesn't enjoy something, my own enjoyment vanishes immediately. It doesn't matter what it is, an outing, a visit, something we do together. If I sense that she feels uncomfortable or gets nothing from it, I withdraw too. Not out of frustration, but out of empathy. Because if she experiences no joy, what is the point? Fortunately, there is still something that works. Car rides, short trips or slightly longer ones, just driving around the area. She sits quietly beside me, but I can see in her eyes that she enjoys it. She looks outside, at the trees, the meadows, the houses passing by. Sometimes I even see a faint smile. It doesn't need to be grand or thrilling, just a small ritual that still works. Occasionally, we visit family as well, but that is becoming increasingly difficult. Not so much because of her behavior, but because of that of others. Conversations are often directed only at me. People seem unsure how to interact with her, as if she isn't there. And that stings. My rule is simple. If you speak to me, look at her too. Speak to her as well, even if she does not answer. At least act as if she belongs in the conversation. Because she does. But people often don't realize that. They want to be polite, or they are simply uncertain. Yet no one is worse off for giving her a kind glance, including her in the conversation, even in a small gesture, a hand on the arm, a look, a few words. She feels it, whether she is acknowledged or ignored. And no, I have never been the type to say sweetheart or darling. I wasn't that way before, and I haven't suddenly become that way now. I have simply remained myself. But occasionally, when I am close to her, I ask her that one question. Do you still love me? She says nothing. But she nods, and I softly reply, I still love you too. That is enough. That is everything. More words are really not necessary. Chapter 7. Daily Life. We have now lived in our apartment for exactly 8 years. We are both 82 years old. And suddenly I realize something remarkable. We have been together for almost 65 years, of which nearly 59 were married. A lifetime, and then some. During this time, that is no longer something to take for granted. But for us, it actually was taken for granted. And now, in retrospect, it seems truly extraordinary. Those old words from our wedding vows, till death do us part, were never a promise we needed as a stick behind the door. We simply did it. We lived life together. And now, in this last long phase, I also live her life alongside her, not because I must, but because I cannot do otherwise. The care has naturally grown heavier. It started slowly, but in the past 2 to 3 years, it has been quite intense at times. Yet it doesn't feel like a task I perform. It feels like something that belongs to who we are. I do not feel alone. No, I feel, how shall I put it, like a professional nurse. Without a degree, without formal training, but with experience. Vast experience. Sometimes I jokingly tell the case manager, if you're looking for nursing students for internships, send them to me. Then they'll learn what real long-term care is. We laugh about it, but there is truth in it. What I do, day in and day out, is no different from what is called personal care at school. Only this, I know my patient better than anyone. For 65 years, someone once said on TV, providing care is an art. I never disagreed. But I had never called myself an artist. Now I think, perhaps I have, in my own way, an artist of care, of perseverance, of simply being there. And you know what? It's going well. We manage, she and I. In the mornings, after getting up, the day always begins in roughly the same way. First, the toilet, sometimes changing, with all that entails. Then washing, dressing, and breakfast. It has all become so automatic that I hardly notice it anymore. Yet each step is a world in itself. During the day, we go to the toilet several times, at set times. That is necessary, because she no longer recognizes the signals herself. And then, as always with this disease, you wait. Sometimes you are lucky, and sometimes just too late. But I no longer get upset about it. That's part of life now. I simply prepare a fresh set and continue. Music often plays in the house, from the 1950s and 60s, the music of our youth. And when I see how she reacts, how she smiles, sometimes even hums along, I know something still lives within her that moves her, that remembers, that feels. At midday I make sandwiches, cutting them into small pieces. Knife and fork have long been foreign to her. And in between, coffee, tea, a biscuit, small things that sustain the daily rhythm. In the evenings I cook something. I am not a chef, I know that about myself, but I always manage to put together a simple but nourishing meal. It often makes me think of Joost, in the well-known books by Martin Toonder in the stories of Mr. Bommel. There is something comforting in that image. Humor too. And we need that. Sometimes she eats by herself. Sometimes I feed her. I feel no embarrassment or awkwardness about this. It is simply the way it is. We watch a little television, or rather, I watch. She sits alongside me, sometimes with a drowsy eye on the screen, sometimes appearing to drift into another world. But we are together, and that is what matters. And then, it is bedtime, often late for us. We have our own rhythm. Undressing, putting on pajamas, helping her into bed. All on autopilot, yet always with care, always with attention. And so we close the day. Perhaps it is a day like any other, but I see it differently. Each day is one we have lived together, and that remains special, despite everything. Moments of rest for myself are rare, but I do have them, usually digitally, sitting behind the computer. From the very beginning, I have been engaged with it. My first computer was a Sinclair ZX Spectrum, with only 48 kilobytes of memory, unbelievable compared to today's gigabytes. Storage was via a cassette tape, which creaked and squeaked while loading a program. But how special it was back then. Being able to move something on a screen, to save text, to retrieve it again, that was a miracle. I still enjoy working with photos, videos, music, all fragments of memories that can be preserved. I also use email and WhatsApp. But social media, no, I have never been interested. That I leave to others. Besides the computer, a drive in the car is my other form of relaxation. And I say this without boasting, but I still drive well. Whether on a 4-lane highway with traffic and complicated junctions, or on a country road in the polder, when I drive, I drive. No stress, no nerves. Only focus, calm, and a sense of the traffic. And I notice that she, my wife, feels it too. She sits beside me, usually silent but relaxed. No fear, no unrest. As if the drive takes her to a world where everything still makes sense. But then, very occasionally, something familiar comes to the surface. If I am driving just a little too close to the car ahead, she suddenly says, "Watch out!" That one sentence, still clearly spoken. I reassure her, "It's okay, don't worry." And then calm returns to her posture. Sometimes, when my right hand rests on my thigh while driving, I suddenly feel her hand on top of mine. No words, no conversation, just that gesture. As if to say, I am still here, we are still here. And then I remember again, however hard it gets, however exhausting the days may be, this moment, this togetherness, this is what matters. Chapter 8. The Future. The simple, almost rhythmic tapping with her right hand is long gone. Where it began as a sort of nervous habit, barely noticeable, it has now become full, sharp blows. She hits whatever is within reach, a tabletop, the arm of a chair, her own thighs. Sometimes I try to gently hold her hand, to calm her, to distract her. It works for a moment, but never for long. When we enter a store, something we do rarely now, I have to be alert. She mustn't grab or knock over anything fragile. Not because she wants to or does it on purpose, but because she simply no longer knows, no longer understands what is allowed. The world has become a labyrinth for her, without a map, without explanation, without a way back. And then there are the blows, even at night, when she wakes for a moment. Short episodes, followed by silence. Fortunately, we still sleep well, together, in our own bed. That is important. As long as it is possible, she belongs next to me. We are already so far apart in so many other ways. But physically, no, I protect that. She literally leans on me. Not figuratively, she has done that for years, but now in a physical sense as well. Her walking grows slower, more uncertain, almost shuffling. Sometimes I wonder, can she still manage? And sometimes I also think, no, this really can't continue. Is the wheelchair the next step? I put it off, like everything inevitable. Because every change is another piece of farewell. And I have been saying goodbye for years in tiny fragments. Sometimes, when I think about it at night, or when I sit alone at my computer, that one thought comes. Let it end for me before it ends for her. It may sound harsh or desperate, but it is, in fact, love. Not that I no longer wish to live. No, that is not it. But I know that I am here for her. And I do not know who will be there for her when I am gone. Even in my grave, I fear, I would still be worrying about her well-being. That is what love does. When you have lived together for nearly 65 years. That is what remains, when everything fades, when words vanish, and sounds are only echoes of what once was. And yet tomorrow, we will simply carry on. The routine. The care. Speaking, even if no reply comes. Holding her hand. Cutting the bread. Putting on the music. And hoping that one small smile still appears. Chapter 9. Conclusion. Looking back over the past 10 years, I see not only the care, the routines, the countless small and large adjustments, I also see life. Life as it is, unpredictable, often harsh, sometimes unfair, yet still rich in meaning. I have now been a caregiver for more than 10 years. Not a title I ever sought, but one I carry with pride. Because this is not just caring. This is the continuation of a promise we made to each other, long ago. Not because it had to be, but because it has become natural, because she is still here, and I am still here. Yes, of course, I had imagined our old age differently. Traveling together, freedom, carefree enjoyment. No nights filled with care, no hands full of pills, no words vanishing into nothingness. But life has its own plans, and we had to adjust our expectations, bend them, without breaking. What I sometimes cannot understand is how it is possible. How someone with a body that has already endured its share, broken back, surgeries on nose and heart, brain surgery, a stroke, can still find the strength to carry this care day in, day out. No day off, no pause, no bench to rest on. Perhaps it cannot be explained in medical terms. Perhaps it is simply love, the strength of loyalty, of connection, of a life built together. Perhaps it is the quiet conviction that as long as she is here, I must also be here, simply because no one else can do it the way I can. I sometimes say, half-jokingly, that nursing students could come here to learn, but actually I mean it. Because care is not just a profession, it is also an art. And I may not be an artist, but I know that this is the most valuable work I have ever done. As long as we live, I live alongside her. And if it ever comes to an end, and that moment will inevitably come, I know that I have done what I could, not out of duty, but out of love. And until that day comes, we simply continue, together, as we have for almost 65 years. Afterward. Looking back over the past 10 years, I do not see a heroic feat, but a life that adapted, a life of caring, of losses, of perseverance. This is not a story to evoke pity, it is a story about love, and yes, also about the art of caregiving. Perhaps that is precisely it. Love is care, and care is art. I hope that anyone who reads this will recognize something, feel strengthened, or feel less alone. Then, and only then, has this little book fulfilled its purpose.